everybody. This is Brian, and this is going to be a quick Lightroom tutorial. Just kind of a basic rundown here. I'm going to go ahead and record this as I work instead of doing a voiceover because I've been really limited on time. I've had a lot of chemistry homework, and so being a full-time student and working and being a full-time dad, I don't have a lot of time to do these kind of things. But I've been promising one of my friends a quick Lightroom rundown video, so I'm just trying to get this done for her. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Lightroom. And I've already got the photo I'm going to be working with today pulled up, but as you can see, it's just a pretty basic picture of my dog. And I picked this picture to do this video for a few reasons. For one, there's nothing special about the photo. It's just my dog on the porch. For another, I think this is one of the first pictures I took with my 50mm. So I was just kind of practicing with the prime lens, but I like that. It's got excellent clarity. All the way up close. You don't see a whole lot of noise. It was just natural lighting. Her eyes are in focus, so a lot of good points here as far as what to work with when you're developing. So I've got my Lightroom module open, and as you see, I'm under the develop mode. And in develop, this is kind of a quick rundown of how I would do this photo, and I'll try my best to explain what I'm doing as I go. So right off the bat, this was shot in auto most likely on my camera mode. So a lot of times, especially with my prime lens, when I'm shooting in auto, my image will come out pretty bright, which is great if you're not processing. However, to get the best results in post-process, a lot of times you want to kind of shoot about a full stop or a half a stop lower than what your finished product would be. That kind of prevents you from losing a lot of detail in these highlights. Well, I didn't do that in this picture, so I'm just going to go ahead and knock down the exposure a little bit until I get some of that detail back. But you don't want to go too far down. I'm going to try to go maybe a little over half a stop down. And that's pretty good right there. The photo's got a full range of tones. The shadows are still defined. Nothing's completely blacked out unless I want it to be. And the details and the highlights have come back substantially from the original. And I'm going to go ahead and crop this in. So in the Lightroom module, if you'll see, you click this crop square up here, and it'll come back. You got your aspect ratio as original. Let's say I'm doing this for Instagram, so I'm going to square crop it. Let me just bring it down to what I want in the photo. And using roughly the rule of thirds, I'm going to kind of center her eyes and snout into the photo. And then I might go ahead and get a little bit more background in there. Okay, so she's roughly centered, and that looks like that would make a pretty good picture. All right, so I've got my exposure dropped. I'm going to go ahead and hit white balance. I like to start most of my images kind of on the cooler side. I think it's easier to work with. And as far as tint goes, I like to go a little bit more towards green than magenta, but keeping it neutral. So I'm going to go ahead and cool this down just a little bit. I don't want it to look blue, but still neutral, but I want to be able to warm it up later in another step. Okay, so that's a pretty good neutral look, and then I'm going to go ahead and move towards green, keeping it neutral, not getting an overall green tone or tinge to it. About right there. And then I'm going to move into the kind of basic settings here. So in most photos, you'd be okay just going ahead and dropping your highlights and raising your shadows. This isn't going to work for every photo. And I'll show you why. As you can see, when I dropped the highlights and raised the shadows, a lot of contrast came out, but a lot of contrast specifically in her fur came out, which might not be exactly what you're looking for when you're editing photos of people. If you want a softer look, it's not a bad idea to drop the whites quite a bit, not all the way. Raise the blacks a little, and then raise your highlights and drop your shadows in quite a bit. As you can see, compared to what I just did with the shadows and highlights, this is a much softer feel to the image. A lot of times when you're shooting people and you don't want skin defects or, you know, peach fuzz on the cheeks, that kind of thing to show so much, that's a good option. But for this photo, oops, let me undo that. I'm going to do the opposite, drop the highlights and raise the shadows. I think this works especially well in pet portraits. I'm going to raise the lights just a little bit. I don't want to overpower the whites or have anything completely whited out, but I do want some of those lighter tones to kind of pop out a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and crush in the blacks. Just kind of, as you can see, I'm not really looking at the slider. I'm actually looking at the photo and just kind of sliding it back and forth until I think the image has a good tone. Right there, that's pretty good. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take out some contrast because even though the photo looks good, we can do a lot better working with the tonal curves. So I want the photo to kind of look really flat here starting out. And that's pretty much the base of my photos. Moving down the line here as far as our settings in Lightroom, I'm going to skip over presence for now and come back, hit clarity, saturation, and vibrance later. I like to move to tonal curves first. So this is where you can really master your contrast and bring out exactly which tones in the photo you want to be apparent. For the sake of keeping this short, I'm just going to go ahead and do the basic soft S curve, which is generally a good setting to get the most out of most photos. So I'm going to slightly raise the highlights, slightly raise the whites, and then decrease the darks just a little bit. And I like to crush in my shadows a little bit more when I'm doing this. I think that gets my contrast pretty well. And then normally if I wasn't just doing this for a tutorial video, I'd sit there and play with that a little bit more and kind of just get the tone perfect. And then I'm going to keep moving my way down. So this is the HSL panel, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And this is going to be where you can kind of control which colors you want to stand out in the photo. So right off the bat, what I see is that red door in the background just kind of comes into the photo a little bit more than I want it to. So I'm going to decrease the saturation on red. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you can see it, if I increase the saturation all the way, the reds around her mouth and around her nose are there. So if I decrease red too much, it's going to look kind of funky in the final product in that area. But I'm just going to decrease red a bit and kind of kill down that door in the background. I can tell you from experience that the primary colors in her fur are going to end up being orange and yellow. In skin tones, sometimes it's hard to tell with people. Orange is usually the predominant one, but depending on your camera settings and white balance settings, sometimes that's not the case. So if you click this little, I don't know, target icon right here and drag it over your image, it'll highlight which values you're working with. So as I move through most of these areas, I'm picking up orange and yellow values. So as I adjust those, these are the areas that are going to be changed. Her eyes are probably going to come up mostly orange. And then most of the time, whites show up as blue. So you'll notice as I move through the white areas, a lot of times those are going to show up as blue. Okay, so coming back over here, I'm going to go ahead and do something that might seem a little weird for this, but I just know from working on pet portraits, the predominant color in orange animals is, of course, orange. But a lot of times if you drop the saturation on the orange and raise the saturation on yellow, you can actually get a pretty neat effect. And it's going to look oversaturated here for a second, but I'm going to fix that when I go into luminance. Now, one thing I always like to do, for the most part, is drop the saturation of my blues quite a bit, and that'll get rid of a lot of the, let me see if I can show you. If I zoom in on her eyes, see, you see how they've got kind of that grayish tinge to them. If I increase the blue saturation, her eyes show up very blue. And that's a huge problem with people where you see more of the whites on the eyes. If you decrease the blue saturation, that kind of goes away. It looks more natural. However, if you decrease the saturation all the way, once again, it looks kind of fake. So what I like to do is just bring the saturation down enough to where the eyes don't look gray, but I still have blues elsewhere in the image unless I want the blues to pop, and then you would have to do a targeted adjustment, which is something for a whole nother video. So I've got the saturation the way I want it. I'm going to go ahead and head on over to luminance. And if you remember, we decreased the saturation on the oranges, and this is something that's only really for orange animals. I'm going to go ahead and increase the luminance a little bit. You don't want to do too much. That'll just kind of look a little bit crazy, fake looking. But I also don't want to decrease it because that's going to decrease the orange in her brown eyes. So I'm just going to bring that orange up just a little bit. And then I'm going to kind of play around with the yellow and see what I can do to get the best feel for this image. A lot of times with orange colored pets, the yellow and orange adjustments kind of work together in opposites. So you can increase the yellows, decrease the oranges, and vice versa until you get the right feel. And actually, I think I'm going to decrease the luminance on the orange for this because I kind of like the way she's coming out with the yellow increased. I'm going to come back here and one more time, just readjust these, make sure I've got exactly the right color combo I want. And I think that's pretty good. Moving down the line here, I'm going to skip split toning for now. We're going to hit that last. Move into detail. Detail is another way you can really make or break your image. So a lot of people out there will say they don't like the noise reduction on the luminance setting here, or to be really careful with sharpening. I've seen kind of all ranges of advice given on this. What I like to do is increase my sharpening quite a bit. As you can see, that brought out a lot of noise in her eyes. But if you move the slider up to about halfway, and then come over here and hit the Alt or Option key on Mac, we're going to go ahead and mask out the areas that we don't want to be sharpened. So we only want the areas, the edges of her face, the lines in her fur, those areas to be sharpened. So I'm going to slide the slider all the way up until I'm only getting sharpening in the areas that I would like. And as you can see, it's pretty much all the way up. However, if I turn off sharpening, you can see the much softer appearance to the lines on the edges of her eyes, on her fur right here. So it's still an essential step. And then I'm going to add some luminance, just not a crazy amount. If I increase the luminance too much, you'll see here as it processes, the photo looks fake. It just doesn't look realistic. It looks kind of dreamy unless that's what you're going for. I wouldn't do that. Somewhere about 25 to 30 seems to be a good median for me in most images to kind of keep the image looking natural. If I turn off this panel, you can still see that we got a good sharpening effect. However, I'm not overdoing it anywhere. And then this color slider here, this is looking at your color noise, which is something that you can't really see unless you're zoomed into like a 1-to-1 ratio here like I am. But I'm just going to bump it up slightly past 50. And what that's going to do is kind of allow these color pixels, which is where most of your noise comes from anyways, to blend together. So you're still keeping all your detail, but colors are kind of, it's like artificially blending them so that you don't see all that color noise where the camera is trying to pick up exact color tones. And then moving down, not a whole lot to do down here on this picture anyways. I am going to decrease, or add a slight dark vignette to it. Somewhere about 20 for a darker vignette is generally a good effect to just kind of draw attention to the center of your image. Now, one thing I do like to do is increase the vignette all the way so I can kind of play with the midpoint and get it exactly where I want it. I like my vignettes a little bit more feathered. And then in 99.9% of my pictures, I like to allow the highlights to come through. So as you can see, if I pull this highlight slider all the way to the right, it's allowing just the highlight tones to show through the vignette. And then I come back up and bring my vignette back down to somewhere about 20 or 30. And I just get this nice gentle vignette that focuses her face without overdoing it or looking too processed. And we're not going to mess with anything else down here. The last couple of things I'm going to do is come back up to split toning. Now this is where you really get the mood for your image to show through if you're kind of a moody photo editor like I am. For highlights, I always start with the same kind of process. I'll click the little gray box up here, bring up the presets that are up at top. I like this golden one. And then I'll come down here for shadows, do the same thing, and pick this blue one. I decrease the saturation to somewhere under 20, usually about 12, 15 or so. And then I'm just going to mess with this slider here along with the saturation values until I get the image to get the kind of like warm, cool mixture that I like. For this photo, I'm thinking maybe a slightly cool setting up here look good, and then I'm going to mess with the saturation a little bit. And as you can see, I kind of got the photo set to where the background's very neutral. She's kind of still shining out with her highlights, but all the shadows are nice and cool. That's usually a pretty good setting if you're going to use split tone. I didn't use split tone for a long time, so it's certainly just kind of an add-on. But versus the regular kind of mood of the image, I think it just kind of has a nice effect. And lastly, I'm going to come back up here to presence. I stay away from the clarity adjustment for the most part when I'm working with people because it does bring out a lot of unflattering contrast, whether it be defects or just, you know, tonal contrast in their skin, stuff that people don't like. However, in animals, it's quite the opposite. I'll usually add quite a bit of clarity. Too much makes the image look over-processed, to be aware of that. Sometimes with other combinations, that can actually be a good thing. But for this, I'm thinking somewhere around plus 30 is probably going to be pretty good. And I'll just slide the slider back and forth until I get a nice effect. Yeah, somewhere right in there, 20, 25 or so looks decent. And then I'll come back and hit saturation and vibrance after I've adjusted the rest of the image to just kind of get the overall feel. Do I want it to look kind of antique-y? If I do, I'll kind of decrease the vibrance but keep the saturation. And I kind of get that, like, I don't know, older, worn look to it. Or I can decrease the saturation and increase the vibrance. Which can also be a nice effect sometimes. For this one, I'm going to keep it simple, probably increase both just a little bit. And no, I'm not either, because that looks kind of cheesy. Let's see. I'm kind of liking that fill right there, just a little bit of decrease on the saturation and vibrance and an increase on the saturation. Once again, this is all kind of based on what you're editing, what look you're going for, but let me show you a before and after and see how we did here. So there's a split before and after. I think I got a pretty good effect here. Go ahead and zoom in on her face. All the details are there. I brought back some of that lost highlight detail. And just like that, easily, I can do this when I'm not talking my way through it, usually in under 5 minutes. You've got a photo that went from, you know, average picture of your dog on the porch to something to put in a frame. So that's it for today. Hopefully I'll be able to put together some more videos here with better instructions and more planning ahead of time. But, you know, as being a student would have it, I'm quite busy. So thanks, and I hope you got something out of this.